Isabel. The Straits of Florida, somewhere north of Cuba, 1994. One day from home. Señor Castillo was in charge of the boat. No one had voted or named him captain, but he had built the boat after all, and he was the one at the rudder, steering it, so that put him in charge. He didn't look happy about it, though. He kept frowning at the motor and the rudder like there was something wrong, but besides a quick patch job of stuffing a sock into the bullet hole, everything was good. The lights of Havana had faded to a speck on the horizon behind them, and they had left all the other boats behind. Isabel clung to the wooden bench she sat on, squeezed in between Ivan and her grandfather. Their boat was barely big enough for 7 people, and with Luis and his girlfriend they were practically sitting on top of each other.
"I think it's time we met the other person on board with us,"
Isabel's grandfather said. Isabel thought he meant Luis's girlfriend, but instead he pushed some of the sacks of food and jugs of water out of the way and pointed to the bottom of the boat. Staring back up at them was the huge face of Fidel Castro. Luis's girlfriend gasped and then suddenly exploded with laughter. Soon all of them were laughing with her. Isabel laughed so hard her stomach hurt. Even grumpy Señor Castillo chuckled.
"I needed something big and thick for the bottom of the boat," he said. "And seeing as there were so many signs around with El Presidente's head on them..."
It was true. Castro's face was everywhere in Cuba. On billboards, on taxis, in picture frames on schoolroom walls, painted on the sides of buildings. Underneath this painting were the words, "Fight against the impossible and win."
"Well, Fidel is thick-headed,"
Luis said. Isabel put her hands to her mouth, but couldn't help laughing again with everyone else. You weren't allowed to say things like that in Cuba. But they weren't in Cuba anymore, were they?
"Do you know what the greatest achievements of the Cuban Revolution are?"
Isabel's father asked. "Education, public health, and sports," they all said together. It was a constant refrain in Castro's lengthy speeches.
"And do you know what the greatest failures are?"
he asked.
"Breakfast, lunch, and dinner,"
the adults answered back, as though they'd heard that one many times before, too. Isabel smiled. That prompted someone to break out food and drinks, even though it was late. Isabel sipped from a bottle of soda. "How long will it take to get to Florida?" she asked. Señor Castillo shrugged.
"By tomorrow night, maybe. Tomorrow morning we'll have the sun to guide us."
"All that matters now is we get as far away from Cuba as we can," said Luis's girlfriend.
"And what is your name, pretty one?"
Lito asked her. "Amara," she said. She was very pretty, even in her blue police uniform. She had flawless olive skin, long black hair, and full red lips.
"No, no, no,"
Lito said. He fanned his face.
"Your name must be Summer, because you're making me sweat."
The girl smiled, but Isabel's mother slapped Lito on the leg. "Papi, stop it. You're old enough to be her grandfather." Lito just took that as a challenge. He put his hands over his heart.
"I wish I was your favorite song," he told Amara, "so I could be on your lips forever. If your eyes were the sea, I would drown in them."
Lito was giving her piropos, the flirtatious compliments Cuban men said to women on the street. Not everyone did it anymore, but to Lito it was like an art form. Amara laughed, and Luis smiled.
"Maybe we shouldn't talk about drowning,"
Papi said, clutching to the side of the boat as they chopped into a wave. "What do you think the States will be like?" Isabel's mother asked everyone. Isabel had to stop and think about that. What would the United States be like? She hadn't had much time to even imagine it.
"Shelves full of food at the store,"
Señora Castillo said. "Being able to travel anywhere we want,
Any time we want, said Amara. I want to be able to choose who I vote for, Luis said. I want to play baseball for the New York Yankees, Ivan said. I want you to go to college first, his mother told him. I want to watch American television, Ivan said. The Simpsons. I'm going to open my own law office, Senora Castillo said. Isabel listened as everyone listed more and more things they were looking forward to in the States. Clothes, food, sports, movies, travel, school, opportunity. It all sounded so wonderful. But when it came down to it, all Isabel really wanted was a place where she and her family could be together and happy. What do you think El Norte will be like, Papi? Isabel asked. Her father looked surprised at the question. No more ministry of telling people what to think or else, he said. No more getting thrown in jail for disagreeing with the government. But what do you want to do when you get there? Senor Castillo asked. He hesitated while everyone stared at him, his eyes searching Castro's face on the bottom of the boat, as though there were answers hidden there. Be free, Papi said finally. Let's have a song, Lito said. Chavela, play us a song on your trumpet. Isabel's chest tightened. She'd told her parents what she'd done, but not Lito. She knew he would never have let her do it. I traded my trumpet, she confessed, for the gasoline. Her grandfather was shocked. But that trumpet was everything to you. No, not everything, Isabel thought. It wasn't my mother and father, and you, Lito. I'll get another one in the States, she said. Lito shook his head. Here, let's have a song anyway. He began singing a salsa song and tapping out the rhythm on the side of the metal boat. Soon the whole boat was singing, and Lito stood and held out a hand to Amara, inviting her to dance. Papi, sit down! You'll fall out of the boat, Isabel's mother told him. I can't fall out of the boat, because I have already fallen for this princess of the sea, he said. Amara laughed and took his hand, and the two of them danced as best they could in the swaying boat. Mommy started counting clave by clapping, and Isabel frowned, trying to follow the beat. Still can't hear it, Chavela? Lito asked. Isabel closed her eyes and focused. She could almost hear it. Almost. And then the motor spluttered and died, and the music stopped.
Mahmoud. Kilis, Turkey, 2015. 2 days from home. Mahmoud could hear music beyond the fence. It was hard to see for all the people. He stood in a long line with his family, waiting at the border to gain admission into Turkey near the city of Kilis. Around them were countless more Syrian families, all hoping to be let in. They carried everything they owned with them, sometimes in suitcases and duffel bags, but more often stuffed into pillowcases and trash bags. The men wore jeans and t-shirts and tracksuits. The women wore dresses and abayas and hijabs. Their children looked like miniature versions of them and acted like miniature adults too. There was very little crying and whining, and none of the kids were playing. They had all walked too far and seen too much. After leaving the car behind, Mahmoud and his family had followed the map on their phone, skirting cities held by Daesh and the Syrian army and the rebels and the Kurds, as best they could. Google Maps told them it would be an 8-hour walk, and they split the journey up by sleeping in a field. It was hot out by day, but it got cold at night, and Mahmoud and his family had left all their extra clothes in the car in their haste to escape. The next morning, they had seen the people. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Refugees, just like Mahmoud and his family, who had left their homes in Syria and were walking north to Turkey, to safety. Mahmud and his family had fallen into step with them and disappeared among their ranks. Invisible, just as Mahmud liked it. Together, the shambling throng of refugees was ignored by the American drones and the rebel rocket launchers and the Syrian army tanks and the Russian jets. Mahmud heard explosions and saw smoke clouds, but no one cared about a few hundred Syrian people leaving the battlefield. And now they were in line with him. All those hundreds of people and thousands more, and they weren't invisible anymore. Turkish guards in light green camo gear with automatic weapons and white surgical masks over their faces walked up and down the line, staring at each of them in turn. Mahmud felt like he was in trouble. He wanted to look away, but he was worried that might make the guards think he was hiding something. But if he looked right at them, they would notice him, maybe pull him and his family out of line. Mahmud stared straight ahead at his father's back instead. His father's shirt was stained at the armpits, and with a quick sniff of his own shirt, Mahmud realized he stank too. They had walked for hours in the hot sun without a bath, without a change of clothes. They looked tired and poor and wretched. If he were a Turkish border guard, he wouldn't have let in any of these dirty, squalid people, himself included. Mahmud's father kept their papers tucked into his pants under his shirt, along with all of their money, the only other things they owned now, besides 2 phones and 2 chargers. When Mahmud and his family finally got to the front of the line, late in the day, Mahmud's father presented their official documents to the border agent. After what seemed like an eternity of looking over their papers, the border guard finally stapled temporary visas onto their passports and let them through. They were in Turkey! Mahmud couldn't believe it. Step after step, kilometer after kilometer, he'd begun to think they would never ever escape Syria. But as relieved as he was, he knew they still had so very far to go. Ahead of them stretched a small city of white canvas tents, their pointed tops staggered like whitecaps on a choppy sea. There were no trees, no shade, no parks or football fields or rivers. Just a sea of tents and a forest of electric poles and wires. "Hey, we're in luck," Mahmud's dad joked. "The circus is in town." Mahmud looked around. There was a main street in the camp, a wide lane where refugees had set up little shops, selling phone cards and camp stoves and clothes and things people had brought with them but no longer wanted or needed. It was like a giant rummage sale, and it seemed like everybody in the camp was there. The path was crammed full of Syrians, all strolling along like they had nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. "All right," Mahmud's father was saying. "A man in the group we walked with gave me the name of a smuggler who can get us from Turkey to Greece." "A smuggler?" Mom said. Mahmud didn't like the sound of that either. To him, smuggler meant illegal, and illegal meant dangerous. Dad waved their fears away. "It's fine. This is what they do. They get people into the EU. The EU, Mahmud knew, was the European Union. He also knew they were much more strict about letting people in than Turkey was. Once you were in one of the EU countries, though, like Greece or Hungary or Germany, you could apply for asylum and be granted official refugee status. It was getting there that was the hard part. "I've been talking to him on WhatsApp," Dad continued, holding up his phone. "It will be expensive, but we can pay. And we'll have to get to Izmir on the Turkish coast. Assuming we stop to sleep every night, that's a 19-day walk. Or it's a 12-hour car ride non-stop. I'll see if I can find us a bus." Mahmud and his mother and sister and brother walked the shopping street. People called out to one another in Arabic, and music from radios and TVs filled the air. Other children darted in and out among the adults, laughing and chasing each other into the alleys of tents off the main drag. Mahmud caught himself smiling. After Aleppo, the near-constant gunfire and explosions, punctuated by the oppressive quiet of an entire city trying their hardest not to draw attention to themselves. This place felt alive, even if it was dusty and cramped. Mahmoud saw a cardboard box of used toys at one of the shops and knelt to dig in it, while his mother and brother and sister walked on. He sifted through it, hoping, yes! A Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. It was the one with the red bandana. The box didn't have any other Ninja Turtles in it, but Walid would be excited to get it. Mahmoud hoped so, at least. Walid didn't seem to get excited about much these days. Mahmoud paid 10 Syrian pounds for it, about 5 cents in American money. A car honked behind Mahmoud, and he turned like everybody else. It was an old blue Opel taxi, traveling so slowly Mahmoud could walk faster. It was the only car Mahmoud had seen in the camp, and the crowd parted for it as it drew closer. A Syrian pop song blared from the radio, and young men and women danced and laughed alongside the taxi. As it passed, Mahmoud saw a young couple sitting in the back. The woman was dressed in a white satin dress and veil. It was a marriage procession, Mahmoud realized. Back in Syria, it was a tradition to be escorted to your wedding by a parade of cars to help carry you into your new life. Mahmoud remembered his uncle's wedding before the war. His uncle had worn a tuxedo, and his bride had worn a dress of sparkling jewels and a tiara, and they had been escorted by a dozen cars to a party where Mahmoud had eaten a piece of the delicious 7-tiered cake and danced with his mother to a real band. Here, the couple's only escort was a group of rowdy teenage boys running behind the taxi, and their destination was a dirty white tent with whatever food they'd been able to buy in the camp's market. But everyone seemed to be having fun. The old taxi's exhaust pipe made a sound like a gunshot, pop, and everybody ducked instinctively. The spell of happiness and safety was momentarily broken by the unforgettable memories of the chaos they had just escaped. Mahmoud's heart was still racing when someone put a hand on his shoulder and he jumped. It was his dad. "Mahmoud, where's your mother? Where are Walid and Hannah?" his father asked. "I found us a ride, but we have to leave now."
Joseph. Somewhere on the Atlantic Ocean, 1939. 10 days from home. Joseph followed the small group of kids through the raised doorway onto the bridge of the St. Louis. The bridge was a narrow, curving room that stretched from one side of the ship to the other. Bright sunlight streamed in through 24 windows, offering a panoramic view of the vast, blue-green Atlantic and wispy white clouds. Throughout the wood-decked room were metal benches with maps and rulers on them, and the walls were dotted with mysterious gauges and meters made of shining brass. There were a number of crewmen on the bridge, some of them wearing blue and white sailor uniforms like the stewards, and 3 more in brass-buttoned blue jackets with gold bands at the cuffs and blue officers' caps with gold trim. One of the regular sailors stood at a spoked steering wheel the size of a truck tire, with handles sticking out all around it. It looked like the steering wheels Joseph had seen in paintings of pirate ships, but this one was metal and connected to a big rectangular pedestal. The shortest of the 3 men in fancy uniforms strode over to the group with a big smile on his face. Joseph recognized him from the Shabbos service. "Welcome to the bridge, boys and girls," he said. "I'm Captain Schroeder." The captain shook each of their hands, even though none of them was older than 13. One of the parents on board the ship had arranged for a tour of the bridge and engine room for any children who wanted to attend, and 8 of them had signed up. Ruthie and Evelina hadn't been interested, but Renata was there, along with a few of the other older kids. Captain Schroeder introduced them to his first officer and the other crew on the bridge, and showed them what some of the gauges and dials meant. Joseph listened eagerly. "This is the engine control for the St. Louis," Captain Schroeder explained. "When we want to change speed, we grip these handles, slide them all the way forward, and then pull them back to the new setting." He smiled. "I'm not going to change the speed now because we've got the engines set right where we want them." Joseph noticed both handles were set to ahead full. "Are we going full speed because we're racing 2 other ships to Cuba?" Joseph asked. The captain looked surprised, and then a little angry. "Where did you hear that we're racing other ships to Cuba?" he asked Joseph. "2 stewards were talking about it the other day," Joseph said, feeling a little nervous. "They said if we don't make it there first, they might not let us in." The captain pursed his lips and glanced meaningfully at his first officer, who looked concerned. The captain turned on his smile again. "We're not in any kind of race," he said, looking from Joseph to the other kids. "We're just making best possible speed because we have calm seas and a following wind. You've nothing to worry about. Now perhaps Petty Officer Yokel will show you the engine room." As high up as the bridge was on the ship, the engine room was just as far down. After stepping through a steel fire door that had "Crew Only" painted on it in big letters, Joseph and the tour group went down staircase after staircase, and they still weren't to the engine room yet. Below decks was very different from what Joseph was used to above decks. Where everything on A, B, and C decks was airy and comfortable, there were no portholes here, no spacious cabins. The air was damp and smelled of cigarettes and cabbage and sweat. Peeking into the rooms, Joseph could see that the crew quarters below decks had 2 beds to a room and barely enough space to turn around. The hallways were narrow and the ceilings were low. Petty Officer Yokel had to duck as they went through doorways. Joseph had never been afraid of tight places before, but the close living conditions made him uneasy. He felt like he was visiting an alien world. The 7 other kids must have felt the same way because they were all silent, even Renata. From down the hall came the sound of men singing, and Petty Officer Yokel slowed. As they got closer, Joseph recognized the tune. It was the Horst Wessel song, the anthem of the Nazi Party. Joseph's skin crawled, and he and the other kids looked at each other nervously. Joseph had heard the Horst Wessel song hundreds of times in the weeks following his father's abduction. It had gone overnight from an obscure song the Nazis sang at rallies to the unofficial national anthem of Germany, and it was frightening. The last time Joseph had heard the song was the day every one of his neighbors had lined the street to salute as Nazi soldiers marched by. Petty Officer Yokel tried to slip the children past the little common room where the crewmen were drinking and singing, but suddenly someone in the room called out, "Stop! Passengers aren't allowed down here!" Yokel froze, and so did Joseph. One of the men got up from the table, a scowl on his face. He was a thick-set man with a bulbous nose, bulldog cheeks, and dark, heavy eyebrows. Joseph knew that face from somewhere. Had he been their steward at dinner? Set up their beds one night? No. Joseph remembered. This was the man he had seen in the balcony the morning of the Shabbos service. The man who had been angry that the portrait of Hitler had been taken down and removed. The man staggered a little, bumping into things as he tried to move through the tight little room. Joseph had seen drunk people leaving pubs in Berlin the same way. "The captain has given these children special permission to visit the engine room, Shindik," Petty Officer Yokel told him. "The captain," Shindik said, his voice dripping with disapproval. Even from where Joseph stood, he could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Yes," Yokel said, straightening. "The captain." On the wall of the common room, Joseph saw a bulletin board with Nazi slogans and headlines from the rabidly anti-Jewish newspaper Der Stürmer pinned to it. He felt a shiver of fear. "Jewish rats," Shindik said, sneering at Joseph and the other kids. Many of them looked at their shoes, and even Joseph looked away, trying not to draw the big man's attention. Joseph clenched his fists, and his ears burned hot with frustration and embarrassment at his helplessness. After a few tense moments, Shindik staggered back to his seat, the threat of the captain's rank still worth something, even so far away from the bridge. Petty Officer Yokel hurried the children along, and Shindik and his friends broke into another Nazi song, even louder than before. Joseph heard them sing, When Jewish blood flows from the knife, things will go much better, before Yaakov ushered them down another flight of stairs. Joseph's legs felt weak, and he clung to the railing. He thought they had escaped all this on the St. Louis, but the hatred had followed them even here, to the middle of the ocean. With its huge diesel engines and generators and dials and pumps and switches, the engine room should have been fascinating, but Joseph had a hard time getting excited about it. None of the other children were excited either, not after what had happened with Shindik. The tour ended solemnly, and Petty Officer Yaakov returned them to the surface, being careful to take them back by a different route. It was a different world below decks, Joseph thought. A world outside the magic little bubble he and the other Jews lived in above decks on the MS St. Louis. Here, below decks, was the real world.